Manufacturing and Industrialization Summit. If I could remind you, please, to make sure that your mobile phones are in silent mode. Our next discussion this afternoon looks at the investments in people and technology that we require to deliver a digital connected industry that is more productive economically and that is more in tune with nature. To lead the discussion and to introduce her panel, please join me in welcoming from RT International, international news presenter and correspondent, Nikki Aaron.
Well, thank you, Declan. Well, needless to say, the manufacturing industry is undergoing substantial changes, and they're happening right now as we speak. And it's critical right now for manufacturers to keep up with these changes in the industry because they're going to have a huge effect on the future of production around the world. But what are those challenges ahead, and are we moving too fast? Well, hopefully, and I'm sure, a very capable panel who are joining me today will be able to answer those questions for us. So please joining on the stage right now is Bernardo Calzadilla Sarmiento, Director of Department of Trade, Investment and Innovation at United Nations Industrial Development Organization. Please come to the stage. Thank you very much. Marco Dietzi, Chief Executive Officer at Holostem Advanced Therapies. Ricardo Marquez Flores, President of the National Industries Association, and Professor Edward Lorenz, Professor of Economics at the University of Côte d'Azur, and attached also to the University of Johannesburg. Thank you all for joining us today. We're very, very, very grateful. Now, why don't we start off with a short introduction from each of you, perhaps define what Industry 4.0 means to you, and what it means to you as well. Please.
Thank you.
No, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good afternoon. Yes, indeed, we have a number of definitions and a number of understandings of the new industrial revolution or Industry 4.0 or smart manufacturing. I think for me, one key element that is there is the acceleration and the speed in which technology has been changing and the blending of technologies that are happening at the same time. Industry 4.0, a key element is certainly data, and from data, the internet, the connectivity. But all this has been happening in a way that has been changing the articulation with other technologies in a very accelerated manner. And this has been leading to have all these new developments that are bringing about with 3D printing, artificial intelligence, automation, robots that can play the piano and very high accuracy and so forth. But we try to see it, and I'm coming from UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. We're trying to see it from the side of manufacturing. What is the implication for manufacturing, not only in the sense of a smart manufacturing and the smart factory, but starting from the factory, how this influencing our society in terms of smart city and how this will affect people. But maybe I leave it at there.
Thank you. Dr. Dietzi.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I would like to introduce an innovative field that from my side is maybe not too much innovative, the biotech. In this field of Industry 4.0 is something that we are living the revolution. The revolution is ongoing. And the new way to cure people that now is, let me say, is on the market is something that changed. And just to give you two snapshots, it's in the past years, till the 90s, there was one pill for all. And now we have one batch for one patient. And it's a targeting measure to define a new cure, a new treatment. These are moving from cancer to cell therapy, regenerative medicine, and everything can be addressed in a different way. And this is a good way to start Industry 4.0.
Thank you. Mr. Flores.
Yes. For me, a vision of the Industry 4.0 means, like Bernardo has said, is the continued development of this digitalization and also energy and transportation combination of technologies and how these interact in a factory. And to see that this factory has to adapt itself to produce at a better cost and at a better quality, and how we can manage to work in this environment, and of course, how to not only accept this reality, but also to see how long we can work with this, how we get there, because especially in emerging markets, not as easy as in developed markets. And this is a big challenge for us. How is the adaptation of a medium-sized company and how it competes with big corporations? And this is the way we see it.
Thank you. Professor Lorenz.
Yes, thank you. Well, I agree with most of what my colleagues have said. I think it's important to make a distinction between the fourth industrial revolution and Industry 4.0. The fourth IR is, of course, much bigger. It includes the transformation of commerce and a rise of digital enterprises, the transformation of technologies and public services. Smart cities can be included. I think when we talk about 4.0, we're focusing in more specifically on the smart factory, the use of new automation technologies or the further development of existing automation technologies, which can be more interconnected and hold out, of course, scope for rapidly increasing productivity, for perhaps contributing to the circular economy. And I think what is perhaps increasingly becoming, as we look at it from as a researcher, it's the increasingly creative ways in which data is being used in combination with these automation technologies.
Thank you. Staying with you, Professor Lorenz, in terms of the novel approaches around manufacturing strategies, what are you most excited about right now?
Well, I'm working with colleagues in South Africa, and we have a project to look at the impact of these new technologies on employment and skills. So that's the kind of issues that I've been mostly thinking about, and I think this is a very exciting area. There's big questions. Will, for example, the increasing use of robotics lead to lower or destroy jobs? There's a question of employment. And I think we don't know enough about actually how these technologies are being used to make informed judgments. There's a lot of, might say, scare stories out there about how something like 40% of all US jobs are at high risk. I don't think this is true. I think as we begin to look at it and study it, we see there may be some job loss in some firms, but there will be productivity growth, and overall the economy, the employment will be stable or may even grow. So I think that's one thing that I'm very interested in. I think it's exciting. Another thing is the skills. We can come back to maybe because you'll be asking us, I think, about skills impacts in a minute. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Lots of things to get through today, including the hurdles and roadblocks that may be ahead for manufacturing in 4.0. Coming back to Mr. Sarmiento, Industry 4.0 has already arrived, as we know. Who's using it, and how are you using it?
For UNIDO, it has tremendous implications in the sense that we have as main clients and beneficiaries developing countries, LDCs. And for LDCs and developing countries, and for enterprises and SMEs in developing countries, it is a challenge to know, first of all, what is going on. There is still, and I agree, the confusion. Robotization was there already in the 90s. We had already computers. We had all these aspects there. But what is important for us is, first of all, to help countries to prepare. And to help countries means that we need to make sure that at all levels, the governments, the institutions are prepared, and the enterprises. So you need to work basically with regulators. There is a need for regulation. There is a need to strengthen and build up institutions. A good example is the project we are having under our program for country partnerships in Morocco. In Morocco, the minister is very keen to bring their aeronautics and automotive related industry up to the state of the art, and they requested UNIDO to help them to set up an excellence center to promote these technologies. And this is a good example of what UNIDO is doing. We're working together with Fraunhofer Institute to demonstrate to the companies what are the possibilities. When we talk about Industry 4.0, and even in Austria, where UNIDO is based, everybody thinks it's very easy, but what I heard is that even for SMEs, it's very difficult to mobilize the funding, to automate so easily. It is very difficult to take the decision, but everybody is aware that something has to happen. So for us, the main thrust is to prepare the countries and prepare the enterprises, first of all, at the level of awareness, and then in a more systematic manner, through surveys, to help them to identify the gaps in terms of digitalization and absorption capacity for these new technologies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. Flores, could you paint us a picture of how 4.0 will affect or impact our daily lives? Could you paint us a picture of 5 years from now, for instance?
I can tell you something that is affecting life right now. I have my son that went to New York last week, and he told me that they are beginning to rent clothing for $80 a month for 6 setups. And I said to him, the only way to do that is with a lot of technology. And not only that, but again, a nephew of mine living in New York, he ordered shorts, and they sent him 14 shorts. And then he only picked 3 of them, sent them back to them. So he only bought 3 of them. And you can only do that with these high processes. This is business processes that you have to come up with. And also the fact that, for example, Zara can ship every 15 days to so many countries the new fashion, and that's only can be done with business processes that are using right now manufacturing 4.0. This is what's happening right now in this field that is very familiar to us, you know. And this brings us to the question that what's going to happen in each field when you have these huge corporations that go into a country and in a way become something like the first players. What happened to the other players? What happened to the middle class? I mean, to the middle business and to the small business. Mm-hmm. And this is the challenge. And I have heard some things here that with manufacturing 3.0, not all the countries have been able to manage it. And since they are not being able to manage that 3.0, imagine what's going to happen with 4.0. And let me tell you something. From the political viewpoint, here is a must understanding between the politicians and the businessmen. In many emerging markets, this connection between the political and business working together is not a normal thing, you know. And that's why countries have not been adapting to this manufacturing 3.0, okay? So now we have especially countries that have managed, like Estonia, which is the #1 country in digital science, but the BBC of of London made a program why in Estonia has the right grown 8% and almost being the second party in Estonia. And they made this program and they went into the interior of the country to the agricultural units familiar, and they asked him, why are you voting for the ultra-right? And they say, because when politicians come here, they think that we are handicapped because we don't have a digital formation. And this is what is happening all over the world. You know, there are people that manage these technologies, but a lot of people that don't manage are the ones that have to be integrated. Otherwise, I don't know how many more manufacturing we're going up, but we're going to have a lot of problems.
Coming to Dr. Diachi, do you think this concern that things are just moving too fast, is it a legitimate worry?
Well, I'm moving in a field that is already probably in the, has already moved on the frontier. I remember when I started in the field of advanced therapies, it was in 2001. And I remember that at that time, the biotech company and the big pharma do not invest in that field. They do not believe so much in that field. But something changed. Because we obtain, I say we obtain results. The company that I represent registered the first product in 2015 based on T-cell lymphocyte for the eye regeneration. And after that, or during that, the big company realized that this can be a market because of mainly the health payer. They raised that this is a cure. They change dramatically or improve dramatically in the sense of benefit, the positive thing, the life of people. There are some treatments that are now reliable on the market, both in the US and the EU. The major technology that can treat cancer, the liquid tumors, the chimeric antigen receptor T lymphocyte, it's something that is now registered, and is now registered from two major big pharma. It's not an advertising for them, but they are now moving in this field. And something that change the quality of life of people. Because, you know, I wanted the last treatment that's been approved in Europe and in the US is for the beta thalassemia. And the beta thalassemia is a rare disease, luckily, but there are thousands of people that suffer this. And they are obliged to have at least 2 transfusions per month at least, plus chemical adjustment and chemical treatment. And it's something that changed their life. One single shot, one boost, you collect the cell, transduce the cell, and reinfuse the cell. And this is something that, from what I saw in 2001, it changed the implementing the quality of life of people in a huge way.
Thank you. Professor Lorenz, I noticed you nodding along while Mr. Flores was talking about some of the struggles of, you know, people not being able to keep up with these advancements. Would you like to add something?
Well, I was thinking mainly of the challenges for enterprises, so sort of focusing on manufacturing. It's clear that, you know, the SME population, small, medium-sized enterprise population, will have a lot of difficulty in integrating and adopting some of the more advanced technologies that will be more extensively used in large companies. Take robotics. I mean, we know that industrial robots are primarily being adopted in a few industries that produce in large volumes, automobiles, electrical appliances, electrical equipment. And it tends to be the larger firms because the fixed costs in terms of, well, we see medium-sized robots here, But of course, the larger industrial robots can be much bigger than that. They tend to operate behind cages. They can be part of assembly line systems that, say, in the auto industry could take as much as 2 years to set up, and huge investments. So these are sort of out of the range of large, small companies. So I think that's a big challenge, because SMEs are the majority of enterprises, even if they aren't necessarily the majority of employment, and especially in say, Sub-Saharan Africa, this is a large majority of companies that are small. So I think one of the big challenges, and I'm sort of thinking of solutions at the same time, is how to develop new technologies that are adapted to small scale and are more flexible. And I think one of the most exciting things coming out right now is cobots, collaborative robots, which are being produced more and more, and are being adopted. I think you mentioned Toyota as a case of a company that's moving a bit back from heavy automation, but also BMW and Mercedes. They are looking to use more cobots, because cobots preserve the position of the employee. They work alongside an employee. They can be easily moved around on a platform of wheels. They can be reprogrammed in a couple hours by the worker, not by a technician. So these are kind of the new kind of, you might say, user-friendly technologies that could be really interesting to think more about. So I think that's looking inside the factory gates. I think it is moving fast, and I think especially small companies, feel left behind at present. So this is a problem.
Thank you. A question for Mr. Sarmiento, please. There needs to be a strong impetus for some companies and businesses to implement these 4.0 solutions. Elon Musk, the brains behind, the big brains behind Tesla, he tweeted last year that humans are underrated, and that heavy automation just didn't have the results expected in his factories. So in other words, if a system works well, why tinker with it?
Indeed, I would like to get back to the idea that at the middle we have the quality of life. And this is a very important concept that we have to have in this migration into this new paradigm. It is about the quality of life. It is about people. And when we think that it is about people, the most important element, I think, is to think, what can we do to prepare people? There will be changes in the market. There will be losses in the labor market, but there will be also a lot of opportunities. And how can we prepare? And I have a single word solution, which is education, because you can name it skills development, capacity development, but there is a lot of need to reskill people. You need to reskill in certain areas in order to enable to use new technologies, to deal with these new technologies, with the robots, with the cobots. But also we need to change the education for people that will lose their jobs, because we will have people that for periods of time will lose jobs. This means this idea of one job for all your life is a way, but people need also to learn how to deal. What is the meaning of life when you don't have work? And for that we need to teach more social skills, more creativity. So the challenge is definitely in preparing the people to this new paradigm, educating, but also making sure that there is inclusion. One of the solutions always said it's more about STEM, more mathematics, but also we need to take into account gender issues. We need to take into account who has access to this type of education. So in my opinion, education is one of the core elements of a solution to prepare to this new future, to be able to, in a smart way, deal with these new technologies.
Thank you. Mr. Flores, Japan is often considered to be at the forefront of technology, and especially in terms of robotics. So it's very interesting how the Japanese car maker Toyota has recently gone full circle and started replacing its robots with human workers again. So are collaborative technologies really the way forward? Yeah, sorry.
I think they'll have a place. I mean, I don't think they're a complete substitute for these highly automated robotic systems that I've seen in operation. I mean, we went to one plant that had made huge investments in robots. They have about 50 now, and they were able to increase their output from about 120 components to over 700 a day. This is a huge leap. So for that kind of enterprise, I don't think they'll be that interested in cobots, but they will have a place, particularly in firms that are interested in customization, high quality, adaptability, where you want to preserve the capacity of workers, because ultimately a robotic system can't learn on its own. Teams of workers can. And I think that's what Toyota is talking about. If they eliminate the role of their skilled workers in terms of kind of quality circles and other kinds of autonomous teams, they won't improve as much as they have in the past, because you'll be fixing a system that will be relatively rigid for a certain period of time. So I think when you're thinking about a learning organization, I'll use that word if it's even a bit vague, you want to think more about collaborative robots and technologies that work with humans and don't replace them.
Mr. Flores, what do you think is the key in finding the right balance between development and also supporting human workers?
Well, I think like the best country that has achieved this equilibrium is Germany, with the dual system. 60% of the people there are technicians. And this is a great achievement. And that's why Germany, I think, is the first or second exporter in the world. And compare something like 90 million people to China, you know. And I think that they have developed this in the last 200 years. And this is a big lesson for any country that wants to create middle class. Because the achievement, to me, is that a country can get middle class. And getting to be middle class, it goes through the training of the people. And the training of the people can be with a regular university, but the big gap to be closed is the technical education. And this can only be done through the private business and the private associations. In Germany, the commerce chambers are the ones that practically dictate what sort of technicals careers are to be taught. And this is why you have this type of achievement. Right now in my country, we're trying to copy that. We have in the dual system something like 400,000 students a year. And this is something which we are now trying to go into different sectors of the economy, not only the industry. And I think like when you're talking about manufacturing 4.0, you have to do the same. Not only the dual system, but also the preparation on the job. Because to adapt to these new technologies, there has to be an involvement between the business and the government. Otherwise, it won't work. As simple as that.
Thank you. Dr. Dieci, what are some of the major hurdles that you found in your sphere in the implementation of 4.0, and how have you overcome them?
In the field of the biotechnology, especially in the field of the cell and gene, machine, robot, let me say that at the time being, maybe really within 10 years from now, can substitute or can support the personal skill. The company that I work for is mainly the 60%, 70% is has a degree and a PhD, and they manage the cell under a hood. So it's difficult to substitute with such a robot this activity. But probably, maybe I'm too old to give you an answer. I'm too ancient for this philosophy. Maybe my kids, my guys, could have the answer. But for the time being, a big breach in the wall has been done because of this treatment cure people. So this was the major issue. I saw much more economical level, that economical support that can be done from private. Well, the company that I represent is, let me say, half and half. 60% is a private company, and the 40% is two professor and a university. But it's the only example in Italy that we have of such an experiment. It works. Now we have 10 years live, and it works. But it's unusual in Italy, such a collaboration. And this works because we have the university that support us, let me say, producing a high level of technician, a very high level of technician. And this can support in the production activities and in the development and in the research, basic research. Moreover, some academic institution raise some development activities that are moving to industrialization, make automatic process, automate some part of the process. In the future, this is something that, honestly, we will see.
Thank you. Mr. Sarmiento, would you agree that one of the major challenges of Industry 4.0 is executives and companies failing to find an obvious entry point?
One important element to be able to agree for that is that there is a different understanding of what is 4.0 and this broader for industrial revolution. I don't live 20 years already in Latin America, but I try to follow what's going on in Latin America. And I was reading the literature, and in the literature, everything they are talking about is digitalization. And when you read about digitalization, they move immediately to ICT infrastructure. They talk about 5G. I have seen a survey from the University of Sao Paulo to see whether companies are prepared. When you analyze the survey, most of the questions relate to this digital dimension and not to the capability to absorb other technologies. Having said that, I must agree that for most of developing countries and the LDCs, a major barrier is the lack of infrastructure. Countries just do not have the infrastructure. You need to have a minimum of infrastructure, IT infrastructure, in order to enable this interconnectivity and this pace of exchange of information. And not last but not least, also that with a weak internet and with weak infrastructure, you face a number of security problems, which is another big challenge for developing countries to migrate into this new area. Safety is, industrial safety will receive a new dimension also here, and it has to do with how you are able to develop your own infrastructure. So I think it's very difficult to agree, but a major challenge is precisely that. Thank you.
Thank you. To Professor Lorenz, please. What are the prospects of those companies that choose not to take advantages of these technologies? What does the future hold for them?
Well, I think it'll really depend on the sector, of course. In some sectors, I think if you don't start investing in some of these new automation technologies, you'll simply find you're not competitive anymore. And in South Africa, for example, in sectors like automotive, this is heavily driven by the OEMs, that's the multinationals. So the component producers that are local, that are producing for Volkswagen, Mercedes, will be under great pressure to upgrade their technologies. They simply won't get the contracts. So I think in those kind of areas, I think it's absolutely essential. But there's other types of production. That's not automobiles is just one very visible, very discussed area because it has such a huge, important adoption of robotics, for example. But I think in much of the sort of more small-scale machine shops, there probably you can get by, and it'll be partly will depend on questions of wages, of course, and relative labor costs. But I think it will depend on what kind of production you're doing. I don't know if that's it's a big question.
It is a big question.
But I think you really need to kind of actually break that down by sector. For example, if you look at the logistics sector, there will be other kinds of changes, but it's not clear, that you necessarily have to have. Some companies we've looked at are investing in what they call smart trucks. They have sensors. The sensors can then automatically judge if the security of the vehicle. They can make an automatic assessment of where your gasoline usage is, how to optimize and have automatic route planning and all these things that we use daily anyway. Probably those kinds of technologies, those companies will do better. So I think it will depend on the country, obviously, depend on the sector, and it'll depend also, on the overall cost of labor. Pretty clearly there will be a factor in taking into account. So that's just partly a partial answer. But in South Africa, I'd say that if you don't, you'll be left behind.
Thank you. To Mr. Oh, go ahead.
Maybe to add, one aspect is the production. And maybe in manufacturing, that's the more sophisticated, the more complex, the more difficult part to introduce these new technologies. But thinking a bit more simple, in marketing, in selling, I mean, e-commerce can be an opportunity for SMEs. It's not Industry 4.0, but it is migrating into a new economy. We know that, for example, in Rwanda, Alibaba is setting what they call the digital export processing zone, where they are bringing together small parcels that are standardized. The view is that you will not need in the future any container anymore, because the new standard is a size of parcels that can be handled by a robot, and the dissemination, this means the marketing, will happen like that. And small companies, even from rural areas, are able to send their produce to this center. So there are other dimensions also that are happening that are not a strict sense Industry 4.0. They not relate to this full automation vision in the companies, but it is this change of technologies and change of life. What you were mentioning, we have the sharing economy, and many things are changing in this sense.
Mr. Flores, as President Putin alluded to in his keynote speech yesterday, sustainable development is a luxury of developed countries, developed regions. So how can we create a balance between sustainable manufacturing, ethical manufacturing, that's also appropriate for countries who are not at the same level when it comes to the Industrial Revolution?
Could you repeat the question, please? The last part.
The question is, as we have these regions and nations storming ahead with manufacturing 4.0, there are countries, there are regions that are being left behind. How can we create a system that's balanced for everybody?
Okay. Well, the obvious answer is to increase that catching up, in terms of education, but more than that, it is that countries have to choose sometimes which sectors they can give a priority. For example, right now, here in Russia, I see that they don't want to depend on the oil and gas, and they are getting into machinery for mining, and they are putting a lot of efforts into this sector developing technologies in machines for mining. And this is something which countries have, in a way, to give a priority to what they can do best. In my country, we have the mining sector, we have the agribusiness sector, and we're going to have another priorities like the forestal and all the agriculture. And so we can develop these sectors prior to another ones, because this is the way many countries can do to do this catching up, because you can't do a transversal prioritization, you know, you just can't do it. So I think this is something that I can see, and especially also in the Arab countries, that the Arab countries now do not depend on the oil industry, but in some other industry that they have developed. And also, I learned here that, for example, they gone into the energy creation through renewables. And to me, that is a very interesting and very intelligent way to go into, give a priority to another sectors which can really give your people more than just depending on oil in this case, you know.
Thank you. Professor Lorenz, I understand you work a lot with developing economies like Africa, for instance. You know, how can we ensure that manufacturing has a lasting positive impact on all countries, and what do governments need to prioritize in order to make this happen?
Well, if I had the answer. No, I think what my colleague was just saying is a lot of the way to address this question. That is to say, you can't expect the majority of countries in sub-Saharan Africa to be entering into global value chains in auto and electrical equipment and be competitive, because they don't have the manufacturing base at present to you know, even come in at a low value-added level. So I think I think, like you were saying, that you have to think about other industries. Agro-industry, widely defined to include all industries that make use of natural resources. It would be an area where many countries would be well placed, because, first of all, these are not areas where global value chains are heavily developed. They're not trade concentrated in the same way that some of the manufacturing sectors are. There's much more scope for local development and for building on local regional value chains, particularly with the growing urban populations. There is a big scope for developing agro-processing industries, I think, that will feed the growing urban populations and their increasing demand for more sophisticated products. So I think if you look at these sectors, you can see a way for manufacturing to develop in countries that have now very weak, relatively small manufacturing sectors. But obviously, I don't think we want to sort of say everybody should be moving into aerospace or automobile sectors, because this is just not realistic. So I think that kind of specialization story has much more appeal as a potential way to go forward than just speaking about industry in general.
Thank you. Dr. Dieci, cell and gene therapy, it's probably one of the most exciting and highly anticipated areas of industry. And what's driving this change? And, you know, is the excitement warranted? Is it this revolution that we're told it is?
I think that we are already in the frontier. There are some issues that, let me say, are more related to give the opportunity to this field to continue, and they are more business oriented. Now we have the proof that this product work well, and we have to manage with the national countries the payment system. It's not something that is related to the industry, but the payment system do not support yet this activity. They are focused more on the oldest way. So something that companies such Holstem are enforced to do is to negotiate with them and to discuss with them a new regulatory pathway, a new pay model, a new market access. Because of, in terms of industrialization, these products can be done in Modena, where the company is, and sent to Africa or sent to Japan. It's an easiest way. It's a nitrogen container, you froze the cell, and you sell the cell worldwide. This is something that is already on, but we have to manage that a patient from Japan, Senegal, or UK can stay there, and then the reimbursement system of each of these states can have the opportunity to produce and to be paid for this product. Of course, they cost. As such, every business has to be maintained with the return of the investment. Who develop these activities need to have this business model in-house so that a possible venture can move on this in this field. But this is, let me say, it's more politics and less industry. And from the industry and from the innovative point of view, I work and I participate to not such an important roundtable such as this one, but really in the last 15 years, it's not unusual to speak about revolution in the terms of using cell and gene therapy.
What would you say is the biggest concern that keeps you awake at night when you consider the future of this sphere?
It's a good question and difficult to answer. Yesterday, the Ministry of Industry, the Russian Ministry of Industry, said that artificial intelligence will have impact on everybody of us in terms of 80%. But he doesn't know in which field or how does it will evolve. Now I read the newspaper and we have all mobile phone, but probably in the future, not in the future 10 years, but in the future very short, we will not use them anymore. I don't know how. I return back. Probably I'm too old to give you an answer. Maybe I don't want to cite anyone, but stay foolish and stay hungry. Someone else will have the answer. I think that in the university, there's a lot of human capital that can be used, can be pushed over to have the right answer, to move in the right direction. You just to, let me say, control, that do not escape and take the bad direction, but maybe this is the answer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. Sarmiento, same question, please.
Well, just to take on the idea that we will have we will lose our addiction to the iPhone. This is a very positive view. I don't think it will go so fast. But indeed, there is the issue of the dependence on these technologies, and I think as we move forward, I'm not dealing so much with it, but it comes to ethical questions, and it comes to the need to have more regulation. I think that somehow these technologies have been moving in a very fast way, and that governments have been lagging behind. They are running behind, and what is running behind is the dialogue. I think that it is important to strengthen again this private public dialogue that will enable to strengthen the innovation ecosystems, because it is only through that you will manage to have a better regulation, but also to take more advantage of these technologies. If you look, and one of your questions is how can we support sustainable development? I mean, it all depends how do we use these technologies. If we put an emphasis on using these new technologies, let's say sensors to monitor the use of energy, the reduce waste, to improve transport, then this new technology, this revolution will be very much instrumental to implement this vision of the circular economy, it will help us to move away, to decarbonize, to move away from this linear thinking to a new, but we have to do something out of it. And in a similar way, we are all looking for a social development that is going more into, let's say, decent work. And again, we touch on something that links to the ethics, because it is about the social responsibility of enterprises. So when we look at the questions, is that we need to reinforce again the values. It's about getting back to values, and it was mentioned before, these are tools and we need to use them as tools, but we cannot use them also only as tools for productivity, for linear growth. We need to use these tools for growth with inclusive and sustainable development.
Thank you. Over to Professor Lorenz now. In terms of policy, which regions are adapting best to what is needed right now?
Which regions or which countries? Worldwide, or it's a big question again. And I think we need to distinguish between developing countries and the developing world, where there's large differences in terms of capabilities and the challenges. I think within Europe, I mean, Germany, Scandinavian countries are very, been very successful on in terms of developing new automation technologies. Not perhaps always the same ones. For example, the cobots are basically the biggest producer is a Danish company in the south of Denmark, and a cluster of automation technology companies, and it's very successful. When we look at Africa, I think we need to then, there's a few countries that maybe stand out. I would say Rwanda, which has a very forward-looking policy on particularly use of digitization. They've been able to, for example, attract Volkswagen, which will be, at least it's planning to establish a construction plant for cars, and it'll not be for selling exclusively Volkswagen cars, and it'll be for car sharing. So it's going to be integrated into the use of a digital platform and an app for car sharing. And it's a kind of exciting kind of development, because you see, on the one hand, this trend towards servitization, where a producer is integrating services into its production, which is another big trend. And then you're seeing the development of an ICT infrastructure, which could accommodate that, and creative young entrepreneurs who are developing applications that can be used, for example, in this case, for car sharing. So I see there's a lot going on there. There's a lot going on in Ghana around agricultural value chains and digitization. There's a lot going on, of course, in Kenya, particularly with M-Pesa, that is to say, mobile phone. But the platform is much more than a telephone. And it's much more than just a money exchange system. It's being used in a whole lot of different ways. As people may know, for example, to sell off-grid solar panels to households in rural areas that aren't connected to the national grid. You can now simply buy a kit and pay off over a year. So you can have a certain amount of electricity access, light, and so on in your home. Since we keep in mind electricity is, in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, it's over half the population don't have access to a national grid. So I think there's some countries that stand out, but if you think about maybe a coordinated policy, I would say perhaps Rwanda stands out, because it's really part of a national strategy. Whereas many of the more creative things happening in Kenya, I think, are just happening spontaneously with entrepreneurship. It's much less centralized. So you get different kind of situations, but there are things happening, and they provide models in one way or another, I think, for other countries.
And how important is investment in driving that?
Well, you need, yes, I mean, vital. You need to attract investors. You need to perhaps be open to public-private partnerships and to foreign direct investment that can come in around some of these projects. A combination of things. I think there's a lot of progress that needs to be made in terms of mobilizing local finance that may exist, but it's not being sufficiently channeled into industrial development. But it's crucial. I mean, if the financial credit problems aren't solved, then these changes won't take place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Mr. Flores, cybersecurity. Now, it's said that cyber attacks and viruses, this is the biggest threat to 4.0. That it has the capability to have a devastating impact on these this new paradigm. What are your thoughts on this, and how are we preparing for such a scenario?
Unfortunately, well-developed countries have the technology to do this. And even though they have the technology, you have seen what has happened in the US elections, Still, there are some leaks over there. And when I say this is like in developing countries, this is something that is just beginning to happen, And of course, it's not only a problem of governments, it's also a problem for companies. And especially in Latin America, we have a lot of work to do in this direction, the cybersecurity, because with these new technologies and with these new AE developments, we need to have a proper cybersecurity. And of course, in a sense, it is the government that has to have the lead, because sometimes the private business is not much interested because there is not a big market, you see? And this is going to go into the companies little by little. It is not going to go like it should be, So I think, for me, it is the government that has to have an initiative to work into this in developing countries.
Indeed. Dr. Dieci, is cybersecurity something that concerns you at Holliston?
Yes, totally yes. We have companies such as Holliston has a sort of register of patient, and this has to be protected. So we have an internal IT that manages this, and for such a field, I think that there will be a sort of worldwide register that can give you the opportunity to target the cure to the right person, to the right place, in the right country. And this is something that we have to be aware, for sure.
Thank you. I'd like to pose this final question to all of you, if possible. So Industry 4.0 has already arrived, and this is just the tip of a very large and expanding iceberg. There's already talk of Industry 5.0, regardless of the concerns we still have about 4.0. How might 5.0 look?
Thank you very much. And before, I wanted to mention something that when you asked the question about geography, in Asia there has been a lot going on, a lot of debates, and even they had their strategies called, the last election campaign in Thailand was called Thailand 4.0. And this brings me to the idea that there has been a societal debate about how to cope with these new challenges. And in Japan, they moved already, and their discussion is how to migrate to Society 5.0. And this brings me to the 5.0, not to the industry, but the society. And the idea is that basically you need to focus on people. And you need to focus on people because, and this is maybe where the Toyota example is coming from, that you need to get back to it. And in Japan, what is amazing, they have not cobots, but they have started to develop a lot what I would denominate social robots, which are companions. And it is going into this idea that these new technologies have to embrace the silver age, the silver society, and has to look at society as a whole in a more holistic manner, and that these technologies need really to be put at the benefit of the people at the core of it.
Thank you. Dr. Diachi.
I think that most of the advanced therapies are already in the 5.0, and the point that the companies such Holostem is try to enlarge the possibility to cure more people and expand this, not market, I would say, but this, the possibility to increase the quality of life of people. There are some rare diseases that at the time being are very dramatic impact on the person. If we can try to push over and cure all of them, this maybe could be the future.
Thank you.
From the second industrial revolution to the third industrial revolution, it was much easier to go from there than from the third industrial revolution to the fourth industrial revolution. If you don't manage the third, then it's going to be very difficult to manage the fourth revolution. That means that it's not easy to jump. And this is where the whole society has to understand, meaning society, businesses, and the governments, to see that the future is there, the future is today, and if we don't catch up with the third revolution, we are not going to make it. So this is a decision that has to be made between society and, again, businesses and the government to do their job.
Thank you. Professor Lorenz.
I think we're still grappling with the fourth, so I'm not going to try to predict what the fifth might look like. I think probably where there's the most, and we've touched on it a little bit, uncertainty at present has to do with artificial intelligence, and particularly machine learning, use of algorithms, which of course we're all familiar that these are being used when you use Waze to get a route found optimized. This will be using algorithms. We're aware that if you watch Netflix, that they will be making propositions for your next film, which is based on an algorithmic kind of decision-making process. I mean, these are in sort of the things that people confront in their daily lives but these tools could be used also in industry. But I don't think we really know where they go. They could also be used to great beneficial effect in health. And we're aware of some of the uses for medical diagnosis, but we don't know how far this will go. And it could contribute to a dramatic decrease in costs, which of course is a big challenge because medical costs are rising in many countries, and they're taking up an increasing share of the budget. So I think this is something to keep a lookout for, and to see how far it goes. And we shouldn't necessarily, again, think that this is something that's going to just eliminate our jobs. I mean, it can be a tool used by, for example, a doctor that could free up his time for other more complicated problems that can't be addressed with this kind of technology. So I think it's something that will have big impacts, but we can't quite see where it's going yet.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for joining us for this panel on manufacturing the future in the era of 4.0. We do hope we've answered some of your most pressing questions. Huge thank you to the panelists here today, Bernardo Calzadilla-Sarmento, Director of the Department of Trade, Investment and Innovation at the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, Marco Diaci, Chief Executive Officer at Holostem Advanced Therapies, Ricardo Marquez Flores, President at the National Industries Association, and Professor Edward Lorenz, Professor of Economics at the University of Côte d'Or.
And Nikki Aaron, thank you so much for your splendid moderation and comparing of that discussion. A round of applause for Nikki, please, and for her panel as they all depart from the stage so that they vacate the seats that our next panelists will now be able to occupy. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are just rejoining us from other sessions elsewhere in the building, or if you've remained in this room throughout the day, I want to thank you for being with us and welcome you to this subsequent panel discussion. This is a showcase for the work of the GMIS Working Group on Safety and Security in Industrial Automation. As manufacturing becomes increasingly automated, as control systems become more autonomous, as processes plug into ever larger networks, as business becomes more reliant on data, how do we ensure the security of our industrial processes, and how do we ensure the safety of the people who work within those processes? These are the issues that we will discuss. We will look at some emerging trends and policy implications, and we will do it in the presence of our panel, Andrei Suvarov, Dr. David Leal, Philip Rice, and Wang Yushong. If I could invite the four of them to join me on the stage, and if you could please give them a round of applause to make them welcome, please. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us for this discussion. I'm Declan Curry, I'm your moderator for this session. Some introductions to our panelists. Andrei Suvarov is the Chief Executive of Adaptive Production Technology. That's a Kaspersky joint venture. You will note that he is not the name in your programme, and we are grateful to him for standing in at the last moment. Dr. David Leal is a Senior Policy Analyst at the Cambridge Institute for Manufacturing at the University of Cambridge. Philip Rice is the Managing Director of Lloyd's Register Foundation, and Wang Yizong is Vice President for the Wuhan Huazhong Numerical Control Company. Welcome to all of you. We also offer apologies from Sergio Emidio Bini of the Friuli Venezia region, who has been unable to join the discussion. And whilst we are continuing to discuss an always connected world, if I could please ask our panelists to resist the urge to use their mobile telephones during this discussion, and if I could please remind all of you to switch your mobile phones to the silent mode. Thank you very much. So the brief for this discussion is to showcase the latest thinking on safety, by which we mean the safety of humans in the workplace, as well as security issues such as cybersecurity, data protection and resilience. We will identify different examples of risks, and we will consider new global and national standards as a framework to boost productivity, to reduce our environmental impact, and to develop truly sustainable industries in harmony with nature. David, why did you start us off? When we look at this world of more connected machines, more automation, the greater use of data, what are the drivers for Industry 4.0? What is setting the pace of change?
Thank you. Well, in terms of safety and security, I mean, we have all heard about these technologies, the Internet of Things, cloud computing, big data, collaborative robots, artificial intelligence, etc., and so on. really the expectation is on one side, on the cybersecurity side, and maybe some of my colleagues will be able to add to that later, is that the expectation is that we're going to have more systems, more components connected and sharing data, time-critical data between them. Particularly for the manufacturing sector, this can be for traditional information technologies, but also in manufacturing, what is peculiar about manufacturing is the operational technologies, so industrial control systems and so on. And this opens the door for cybersecurity attacks that can target those vulnerabilities in operational technologies. You're going to have big volumes of data that we haven't seen before. And operational technologies really traditionally have not been very focused on or thinking on cybersecurity. So that's on one side. On the other side, in terms of safety, really the expectation is that all these technologies will introduce new ways of working. And in particular, there will be more intensive interaction between humans and machines. Also, the expectation is that manufacturing processes and factories will be more reconfigurable, more dynamic, and it becomes harder and harder to assess the risk factors in these reconfigurations, in these new ways of working. We need to be able not only to design things for safety, but we need to be able to certify that things are safe, and we need to be able to, once things are in place, we can monitor risks better and manage risks when they happen.
And Philip, this is an important point, that this is relevant. We are having this discussion today because this is happening in more and more businesses. We are seeing the greater introduction of digital technology, the greater integration of digital with manufacturing processes, all the way along the supply chain, all the way up and down in terms of vertical integration and throughout the life cycle of the product or service.
Correct. So, I think just as a sort of starting point, the International Labour Organization estimates that 3.9% of GDP is lost every year to issues relating to workplace health and safety. And so within that context, and within the context of the changing 4.0 environment, what we have to consider is how can that be used for good? So there are a number of organizations that are looking at how you use wearable technology, visual analytics, all sorts of 4.0 technologies to try and improve health and safety in the workplace. But we also need to recognize that it introduces a risk. And we are only at the beginning of starting to understand how to deal with that risk and how that risk is different from the risks that industry has faced in the past.
And this is relevant to you because of Lloyd's Register and what it does and its background over many centuries of identifying risk, quantifying risk, and
Correct.
minimizing risk.
Correct. So Lloyd's Register is an independent verifier and certifier of standards, be those quality standards or health and safety standards. And so our role in industry, and the organization is 260 years old, and actually started in the first industrial revolution, has been to look at the impact of how do we keep people safe in the industrial workplace.
And in this context, that is being done looking at new ways of organizing work, new processes within industry.
Correct. And I think what is safe to say at the moment is, if we look at the actors in industry, so if we look at how the standards organizations are responding, how the research organizations are responding, and in fact how operators are responding, they're all in a position at the moment where they are kind of playing catch up, if I'm honest, and so it will take time to establish these standards. The risk for industry and for the adoption of Internet or Industrial Revolution 4.0 is that things get delayed by this lack of standards, this lack of understanding of the application, and just overall a lack of the pace of establishing those.
Thank you. We'll pick up some of those points and develop them later in our discussion. But when we talk about the drivers of change in industry and what that is doing on the factory floor, I'm very pleased that Wang Yisung is with us, as your company, sir, is a great example of how interconnected digital industry is changing. Describe for us, please, your company and the work that it does.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. That's fine. 感谢主持人，这个给我这样的一个机会哈。首先，我想，应该先介绍一下，简要的介绍一下我们华中数控股份有限公司，因为如果我要不去介绍它的话，可能我们在座的各位没有听说过它，不知道这个公司它是做什么的哈。所以呢，给我。
We need to know what any specific organization is doing. So I can give you an example of our company. I work for Wuhan Honzhong Numerical Control. We develop and build high-tech equipment for measuring things. We work with Siemens and other Western corporations. I would like to tell you about our company and share some of my thoughts. In the city of Wuhan, we have an organization that has been incorporated in 1994. We had very strong links with the local university. Our manager, the founder of the company, was a minister of education in People's Republic of China. Our university is one of the leading centers that develops digital control systems. Every year, we develop about 20,000 different devices that are digitally controlled. This is a very big manufacturing company. We do a lot in the way of mobility. Internet of Things is another area where we're very active. These technologies grow and develop rapidly. What is different about our company is that we keep a close eye on the level of training of our employees. We have great hopes for artificial intelligence. We look into new manufacturing technologies. Smart manufacturing is a big thing for us. And we use several different technologies and approaches at the same time. Smart manufacturing includes 4 things for us. We focus on continuous improvement. We focus on training, on decision-making, and implementation of the decisions made by the management. This makes us a strong business. We make numerically controlled tools, and we are one of the oldest companies in China. We started specializing in this field earlier than most of other people. We produce machine tools of new generation. We design our machinery. We use the latest and greatest software for the design work. It is very different from what people used in the past. We work more efficiently, more reliably. We have good opportunities for collaboration between our workers, and we use materials better. So that's what we're doing essentially.
David is a wonderful example of some of the wonderful example of some of the processes of change, the drive of change that you were describing in your opening remarks. This is Mr. Wang's industry is exactly the type of industry that needs to consider the issues that we are discussing here today. One of China's oldest businesses, he said, yet one that is at the cutting edge of technological innovation.
Absolutely. Even before the panel, I was talking to Mr. Wang about how they're trying to use real-time numerical control, machining, milling, etc. And I remember when I was in university, back in the day, I'm not going to say the date, but we were trying to think about how could we ever do real-time quality control in machining. And it's fantastic to see that we have arrived to a time when the technological advances actually allow companies like Mr. Wang's company to work on this. And this can actually have a great impact in terms for manufacturers. You know, you can reduce waste, reduce energy consumption, and so on. So really, from the factory floor perspective, is really quite a contribution.
Mr. Suvorov, this is an interesting discussion for you also, because when we talk about progress in this area, it is not just the tasks of the machines themselves, it is the software that controls them, and it is the data that informs their actions. And these are an important part of any discussion about safety and security, is securing the data that drives digital business.
Yes. For the topic, which I would like to share with you from the perspective of the company who has been specializing for cybersecurity for the last 22 years. I represent at the same time today a new generation of engineering companies. This is a joint venture of Kaspersky Lab and industrial company Itelma, which we created 1 year ago to bring to the market of industrial Internet of Things new quality for cybersecurity. I am proud to be here because this is my second GMIS. 2 years ago, I was invited to Abu Dhabi and had a good speech with the professionals about the topic of cybersecurity. And for me, it's a good sign that we speak more often, not about cybersecurity and cyber incidents, but we use term cyber risk, which means that we should understand that it's not anymore about particular task for our IT people or IT security guys. This is definitely should be within agenda of the board. One anonymous button push can lead to the incident, which can cost to the company some volumes of money, which is comparable with the profit. So we had a huge collection, you know, very sound public cases when some epidemic or cyber attack can lead to the losses. And it's not only about intentional cyber attack. With all type of connections and complexity, it can be even a result of some system upgrade, or it can be result of people within the company who are trying to arrange some fraud exercise. So all of this can lead to real business losses, and this is imperative to discuss it on the high level, not only on the level of technology. Because we see it as a...
May I just interrupt? Mr. Wang, do you agree this is so important, it is a matter for the board, for the boardroom? Let me ask again, do you agree with Mr. Suvov said?
是的，我非常同意这个安德烈这个看法。现在这个万物互联这个时代，我们第4代工业革命这个到来。
I totally agree with this point of view because in the Industry 4.0 time and the IoT time and era, no sound.
Thank you so much. Mr. Savarov, let me bring you back in then to help us identify the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities in business as you see them today. David and Philip have both talked about larger networks within businesses, that you have processes that are interconnected in a way that was much greater than before. That creates a greater vulnerability to cyber risk.
Yes, completely agree. One more topic I would like to emphasize, that in comparison with IT world, manufacturing landscape have much more standards and approaches. So we see many respectful vendors who are trying to present their architectures on the level of industrial control systems. First statement, they are not the same as on IT level. They use different standards and protocols, so Modbus, S7, etc., which are not compatible with the level of enterprise architecture. And second, it should be noted that in case of digital industrialization, we deal with pneumatic, electric, and hydraulic. So any incident can lead to serious machinery breakdown or unplanned outage. This all leads to necessity to discuss specific of cybersecurity mechanism and solutions which cannot be applied from traditional IT world. So we should follow from threat model on particular production, on particular story. For example, here during these days, we present our industrial gateway, which provide secure connection from CNC machine up to industrial Internet of Things platform with a much more secure level to connect between OPC industrial standard, which cannot be applied with traditional IT products, to traditional analytical platform. So this is one of the examples.
And Philip, this speaks to your point about the need for better, higher common standards, which is something that perhaps we might return to later in the discussion, but it's worth making that observation now.
Absolutely. So I think we are still very much in the stage of agreeing on which standards should be used. And it's worth noting that if you take lessons from history in terms of the introduction of new technologies, it's very unfortunate that it's often a catastrophe of some sort that leads to people sitting down and having that discussion and that debate about how do we get better standards, how do we get better interoperability, and make sure that we're not going to experience that type of thing again. And
whereas it would actually be more cost effective if preventative measures were taken before.
Exactly, and you've seen that through the advent of steam power and the introduction of boilers. You've seen that in the 1930s with disasters that happened for the likes of BASF. In fact, I would even touch on it to say that we're seeing some of the considerations around this in what Boeing is suffering from at the moment as well. So the question then is, what can we be doing now to avoid any of those types of catastrophic loss situations. And just to add to what my colleague has said, I think the main concern that we have is while financial and data loss is one of the concerns, the element that he touched on is that we're seeing this blurring of information technology and operations technology, where actually there can be harm to life and property. And that's the area that we should be most concerned about ultimately.
There is more to say about cybersecurity, and we will return to that presently. But Dr. Dahl, I wonder if, certainly in the media, there is more coverage of cyber attack, of cyber crime, and rather less attention paid to some of the other risks and factors which are identified by the working group in the report that the group has published, some of the human factors. I wonder if perhaps safety is simply less sexy than cybersecurity.
I think that's absolutely correct. It is less sexy, but not least important. As my colleagues have been explaining, really the issue here is not only new technologies pose new emerging safety risks in ICT, but also cybersecurity and safety are merging. So the introduction of cyber physical systems opened the door for cyber attacks, as they were saying, to lead to physical asset damage or injuries, physical injuries of people. And as they were talking about losses, this report that I have here that you might be able to find outside of the hall has a nice taxonomy of potential risks for manufacturers. And as Andre was saying, this can be the cost of these losses, either financial or because of third-party liabilities, or because it actually happened, led to an accident. It can be quite high. And the other point is, this is a reality. This is something that is happening now. This is not something in the future. This is something that is really going on right now. In the UK, for example, just to finish, there has been recently a survey on cybersecurity concerns of manufacturers. About half of them said that they have already experienced cybersecurity issues. And in terms of safety, there's just a need to raise awareness and to do more foresight exercises to really understand what the implications are. At the moment, these are not very well understood.
Well, let's look at some of the safety risks that you have identified in the working group, and some of the physical risks, first of all. We have mechanical, the risk of mechanical damage, electrical, thermal, the whole issue of if you have more robots and autonomous robots perhaps moving around a factory floor, that increases the physical risk.
Absolutely. And so now with autonomous vehicles in the factory, it's not only that there are new unknown risks, but it becomes very difficult to assure safety of these systems. At the moment, there are not really standardized methodologies, regulations about how to do this. And it's part of the work that Lloyd's Register Foundation is sponsoring. For example, there's a project that I know they are doing in York University on the safety assurance of autonomous systems, which is very critical and important. So, yeah.
Yeah, but Philip Rice from Lloyd's Register, physical risk on the factory floor has existed for as long as factories have existed. Your challenge is predicting how much greater the risk is in an autonomous environment, how to quantify it, how to mitigate it.
Correct. So I think one of the ways, and the research that has been done that David was referring to, draws this distinction is if you look at the health and safety aspects. So there is a health aspect in terms of psychosocial well-being and kind of long-term health effects of working in an environment where you are either working with autonomous systems or cobots. But then there's also a safety aspect to that, and the safety aspect is obviously a much more immediate and a much more obvious area to focus on. But those are the sort of two the two areas to consider. And what we see is that while there is a lot of activity from the different actors who are concerned about safety and security, it's still not being coordinated. So we have some reference in ISO standards, for example. So there's ISO 10218 and ISO 15066, which do make reference to the use of robotic systems and cobots, but it's not been integrated as a whole. And what we're seeing is there are a range of sort of national initiatives at the moment that probably need better coordination and need to be brought together. And I think the hope is that forums like GMIS provide the impetus for that to start to be put on the agenda.
David.
Yeah, just to add to that, to my previous answer, when we speak about safety risk, something that is really overlooked and not talked a lot about has to do with psychological and psychosocial risks of workers in new Industry 4.0 environments, let's say it. There are concerns that the use of all these new technologies could lead to more stress in the workforce from oversight, excessive oversight. People, there will be pressure about performance of workers. And that is something that is really not studied very well at the moment, and that we need to put attention into that, because it is just as important.
You mean additional stress from controlling the robots, from managing, supervising the processes, or you mean the potential for more automated surveillance of individual employees and what they are doing in the factory?
Both things, really. And it's also the fact that there's new ways of working that people might not necessarily be ready for. Work will be more individual, less social. So this is something that is really not mentioned a lot. People tend to focus on physical risk, mechanical risk, electrical hazards, etc., etc. But I think this is something that we need to pay attention right now.
Mr. Wang, as our distinguished and esteemed industrialist, I would be interested in your perspective on this discussion about physical safety.
Well, I do represent an industrial facility. I am an industrialist, and speaking about cybersecurity, speaking about defense against risks, I would like to say that this is something that is definitely on our agenda. And this is not just an issue for producers, for manufacturers. This is a matter for a national strategy. This is an international level problem or challenge. Over these 2 days at the GMIS summit, this is something that is talked a lot about. And I mean, this time that we live in, within Industrial Revolution 4.0, we've been talking about this incessantly for the last 2 days, and we, facilities, we have our own observations that we can share. We, at our association back in 2016, we created a union for standardization, for standardizing various processes that deal with using numerically controlled tools in our production. And there are a lot of clauses there. What should be checked at inputs? What do I mean by this? That's when we talk to our customers, those who order things from us. At this point, we need to start talking about digital security And this union of likely facilities is something that gives those facilities a permission and authorization to be involved in particular activities. This involves a whole hierarchy of various steps. We have been really involved in this on the national level, on the government, on the state level. What has been done is this. We have this law on cybersecurity since June. This is a national level law. This is something that covers the entire country. And as for our specific company, I'd like to say that we too study the international experience quite diligently. And I believe that I would be proud to tell everyone that last month, on June the 27th, I participated in an intergovernmental fourth subcommission that prepares the regular meetings of the prime ministers of Russia and China. And at that meeting, we discussed the following, that maybe, together with our colleagues from Russia, we could reach certain agreements on working towards some common standards in the manufacturing area. I'm talking about safety issues at facilities that produce these types of machines and products. So we hope that we are going to be able to prepare the requisite personnel, people that would be able to prevent attacks from happening, prevents these risks from materializing. And I think this is something that we should begin with. And prior to this panel session, we had a discussion with Andre and Philip. We also reached out to the two universities present here. And I hope that what we're discussing today will serve as an impetus for us to move even further forward. We will strengthen these connections with the university and with the academic community, and of course with the industrialists in the area of industrial safety.
For that observation. And Philip, it seems everyone wants to talk about standards, and we will get to that stage, and also the idea of collaborative working on this. But Anders Sivert, if we could just pick up the thread that you had laid in, that Mr. Wang elaborated on in his comments just now, the security risks that are identified, some in this report, but also from your own experience as someone who is responsible for these areas. What are we looking at? We're looking at a vulnerability of control of the manufacturing process itself.
Thank you for the question. I would like, first of all, to contribute the last comment and respect this opinion, because I see that the new time of industrial Internet of Things require ecosystem building. In the nearest future, even right now, we see that no one company can provide one solution for the modern plant. Moreover, many valuable services will be provided from cloud, covering suppliers, producers, and customers. And companies will win if they will accumulate the services in some ecosystem, which means that no one company can provide cybersecurity, another one just sensors, actuators, and other stuff. It should be definitely agreement. It should be alliance. It should be conclusion of standards and protocols. Regarding industrial topic, I would like to say that we in our team are on the way to meet all type of cybersecurity aspects for this new architecture of industrial Internet of Things platforms. One example, we are working on vulnerability monitor, which will bring a new quality of some weakness handling for non-computer elements. We all know and we all have some antivirus software on our laptops, but not all of us know that gateways, routers, video cameras, they don't look like computer, but they are computer. And we don't have vulnerability management for this type of devices with the same efficiency as we have for our IT stuff.
Yet for those who wish to cause us harm, they are points of entry. Those routers, they can be used.
This information is available, exploits are available, and our mission and our mutual obligation how to do it ahead of bad guys, ahead of incident which may happen based on this vulnerability. So it also requires coordination. So currently we work with the many vendors to accumulate vulnerabilities found and then to distribute these vulnerabilities in the way of standard packages. So customers who run IoT platform can understand, I use this PLC. This PLC just got new one vulnerability from June 2019, and these are recommendations how to handle it very quickly. So it will bring more resilience, it will bring more efficiency in a way how to fix vulnerabilities found.
Is there a greater risk because more data is being processed? Because companies are dealing with more data, because they're gathering more information about their customers, because they are using more data to drive more processes? Is it simply that increase in volume that is generating increased risk?
Not because of volume itself, but because of decisions which may be taken based on this information. So currently, based on World Economic Forum, about 80% of physical assets still are not connected. So which means that if we will be able to connect them in the nearest future, we can get a new value for our business. One example, in Europe we have a company which sell currently not engines. So they produce engines, but they do not sell engines anymore. They sell a service with the name rotation as a service. So they calculate number of rotations and provide billing based on this type of effective, valuable service of their products. But it requires absolute transparency between customer environment and the plant who produce engines. Because if you have a data confusion, you will not handle this process in a proper way. So transparency also part of cybersecurity story, because it's about money and it's about financial transaction. So you have to be 100% confident that data which are generating on the level of customer are relevant, valid, and reliable.
David, is there enough recognition within traditional manufacturing industry of the strategic importance of data and the importance of preserving and protecting that data and the use of that data?
Well, I think with the advent of all these new technologies, there is more and more recognition that you can get a lot more out of your data. We have always had data from different systems, but most of the time with current and old systems, this data is not in the same format, it cannot communicate, you cannot compare it to another set of data set from another machine, etc. So there is an increasing interest in seeing how we can actually make sense of all this data and use it to improve our processes. But as Andre was saying,
in terms of understanding, really understanding its value and therefore doing enough to protect that value.
Well, that's an issue, the awareness. If we think about manufacturing, we tend to think about really big companies, the Siemens, the GE, etc. The reality is that manufacturing, in the work that we do in Cambridge, we work for different governments around the world, and we get to talk to a lot of manufacturing companies of all sizes. The reality is that most of manufacturing is composed by small and medium enterprises. The small and medium enterprises are very focused on their day-to-day operations. They do not have any expertise most of the time on cybersecurity, and most of them don't even know what Industry 4.0 is. So awareness not only of Industry 4.0, but then about safety, security issues, and the potential value of data that you can get out of these new technologies is quite low, I would say, for manufacturers.
So from where do they get that expertise? From where do they get that awareness? If they are so busy just running the business, who's going to help them?
Well, that's some of the part of the work that we do is we review national initiatives from different governments around the world that are aimed at doing exactly this. They try to help their manufacturing sectors to create awareness. This can be done either directly by government institutions or innovation academies, etc., engineering and scientific academies, etc. But the key is that usually government is the one that is intervening to create awareness campaigns. We see that in particular with cybersecurity, the UK is a good example, Japan, Singapore, they're very active on trying to communicate these to businesses. And actually that's a topic that is also mentioned in the report, again, if people want to have a look.
Wang Xusong, your reflections on the importance of data, the strategic importance of data, and whether companies really do appreciate it.
Yes, indeed. We are the industry people. We don't have 100% understanding. We are far away from that. In our field, where we produce numerically controlled tools, we have this alliance that I've been telling you about, and it does not include everyone. There are a lot of medium-sized companies that are still dormant. They have not suffered yet from cyber attacks. When it happens, when they have trouble, then they wake up to the problem and start dealing with it.
To them, of course. One way of protecting data is to become isolated, to isolate that data from others. But actually, there is great value from the sharing of data. We want to have security, but also the tremendous value from sharing.
Like I said, we are witnessing the fourth industrial revolution. We cannot become isolated from the rest of the world. We cannot stand still as technical progress goes on. This would be dumb. How can we get protection from threats? Well, laws should help us. Governments should do more to take extra steps to protect us. We, at the level of our company, cannot fight hackers. Those people who want to implant malicious software in our systems. But this is something we talk about. We cannot even address this system at the level of a country as big as China. We have to all get together and fight the wrongdoers. Governments of all countries have to pay more attention to legislation, including international legislation, to counter such threats. That's been my observation.
Thank you for that. Philip Rice of Lloyd's Register, an excellent jumping off point to a discussion on what needs to happen next. International cooperation, some form of legislative structure and framework, and a framework of standards that either set a basic level or something more aspirational to which we aspire.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think Mr. Wang sort of very eloquently stole my thunder a few moments ago.
Lightning does strike twice. That's fine.
Because he very eloquently listed 4 things that need to be done, and I think those 4 things align very closely with the findings of the research report. The research report goes into a lot more detail behind what has been done so far. But the 4 things that he spoke about were the introduction of standards, and those standards need to be international standards in their nature. And so there's a real opportunity there for working across governments. There needs to be better cooperation. And so that cooperation really requires the involvement not only of governments but of industry, of research, of the different parties that that actually have an interest in the risk that's created. There needs to be better sharing of data, and in some industries we are starting to see that. So in the shipping industry, which is one that we have quite a lot of knowledge of on one side of our business, there is an initiative where information about any cyber attack that takes place onto a shipping company is sent to an independent party. That data is cleaned, it's separated out so that it's not identifiable in terms of who was the attack was actually executed against, and then shared amongst various shipping companies so that they can think about how they respond to those types of things. And then the 4th point that Mr. Wang mentioned was about skills, and developing the skills for people to understand what are both the security and the safety risks related to Industry 4.0.
Skills I will come back to in a moment or two, but just on this question of standards and setting standards, standards of course first have to be evaluated and determined, and that process sometimes takes an extraordinary amount of time. That needs to speed up.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if we just take an example, one of the most recent examples in the International Standards Organization was the move from 18,000 to 45,000, which was the new occupational health and safety standard that has been released last year. That journey took 5 years. So for the International Standards Organization to convene, to create, to debate, to finalize the move from 18,000 to 45,000 took 5 years.
Okay, how do we speed that up?
That's the question that I think we need to be addressing and addressing head on, because it needs to be a national issue. I think standards come to the fore, as I said, at times of crisis and in times of catastrophe when something happens, and actually we can't afford to let those things happen. Where we need to get to through the right forums, and in fact with the involvement of the likes of UNIDO, who's obviously a founding member of GMIS, is accelerating that process.
But standards already exist. Some of these issues that we are discussing today are as old as industry itself. Why do we not simply take the standards that were designed for a physical, isolated factory and simply replicate them across?
So I think you will always be able to learn from previous standards, and if you take something like additive manufacturing, so 3D printing, which is one of the technologies that sits within the sort of bundle of fourth industrial revolution technologies. The standards can be applied in part, but they are not comprehensive enough to understand some of the new implications. So if you look at additive manufacturing processes, you need standards that are going to regulate the quality of powders. You need standards that are going to regulate whether the powders that are being used are safe in working environments. You need standards that apply to the fabrication facilities, the atmospheric conditions, humidity conditions, all of these types of things in those fabrication facilities. You need standards for post-processing activities, because if you're providing a pressure treatment or a heat treatment to something, it can affect its physical properties. And then you need standards that are going to be applied for to the actual finished product. So while we have standards for manufacturing, traditional manufacturing techniques, the integration of all of those different parts into new standards for additive manufacturing, let's say, doesn't yet exist. And there's also, in additive manufacturing, a question about data. So, when you 3D print something, some of that is defined, or the quality of the final product is defined by the data that is being provided to the printer, and that in itself is vulnerable to change or to integrity issues. So that's what we need to look at, is standards for the new technology that we are currently having to adopt.
Thank you, David. Standards, of course, set the letter of the law. What also matters is the spirit, is the culture within organizations to make it more aware of the safety and the security issues, to identify the risks proactively, and then to do something about it before it becomes an expensive crisis. How do we build that culture?
Well, particularly in terms of cybersecurity, for example, I think something that we see that might happen is that insurance companies can drive this change in culture. So insurance companies are acquiring more cybersecurity expertise, and they will start going to manufacturing firms and asking for more detailed cybersecurity minimum requirements. And when companies are faced with this situation where they cannot claim insurance for potential vulnerabilities, that will start driving a change, or I hope so at least. It's difficult, the truth is that it's difficult. Safety culture, I think, has always, occupational health and safety has come a long way in manufacturing. If we remember the first industrial revolution to now, people almost no longer die in factories around the world. So that is a very well-developed area. I think the safety culture, I would say in most manufacturing or advanced manufacturing companies and plants is very well established, and it will continue to be. It's just a matter of understanding what the new emerging risks are and how can we address this. That's why these things are all interrelated. We need foresight studies to understand how this is going to play out, but all these foresight exercises are going to inform our research and development needs, and this is going to inform the development of our standards. And then we need the skills to implement the standards. So what is complicated about standards is that usually you have a community of people working on safety standards with a particular expertise, and a community of people working on cybersecurity standards with a completely different expertise. It is the overlap, as we say now, because these two communities need to start talking to each other. They need to start collaborating. You need to introduce more cybersecurity concepts into safety. You need to introduce more safety concepts into cybersecurity, and that is the challenge, where working groups, such as the one proposed by GMIS, could have an impact.
Mr. Suvorov, you agree that we need more collaboration, that we need to talk to each other more?
Yes, completely agree. Being professional in IT area and cybersecurity, 3 years ago I jumped into conversation with one of world leading insurance brokerage company discussing new type of insurance contracts, because for that time it still be unresolved for many companies. Any possible machinery breakdown or unplanned outage which were caused by computer or software were outside of traditional insurance contract. So we checked many underwriting reports. We saw many interesting type of risks they are trying to assess, like exposure that helicopter will fall down, but nobody put specific part of the document with possible risk that someone will harm by incident or unintended attempt from computer. So now we see, I know a couple of positive examples when insurance companies provide such type of insurance contract. Yes, I agree. And of course, we, in this case and in many other cases, we rely on human behavior, on human mistakes. If I may, I would share a short, interesting story to increase level of security for all of you. It happened in 2015. Kaspersky team discovered this targeted attack with name of Dark Hotel. So you may check Dark Hotel in the internet. And it happened because they compromised couple of network equipment in a set of luxury hotels. And they're waiting for particular top managers of some Asian corporations. Because when you are in the hotel and when you are checking into your Wi-Fi network, you put always your last name, like Suvorov, and your room number. Bingo. They identified a couple of people, and after this login with the compromised network equipment, they provide some faked page with the logo of the hotel and with request, dear Mr. or Mrs., you have to download update to have a successful connection. So my advice, and please use it in your daily base, if you are in the hotel and if you are connecting with the starting page, and if someone asks you to download something, even with logo of the hotel, stop it, call to the reception, and check if it's real download from the hotel. At least you will be more secure.
I wish you had told us that when we all arrived for this summit and checked into our hotels. It may be...
Yeah, it starts always from social engineering, from some behavior.
And just addressing Philip and David's point about the importance of skills in your area of expertise in cybersecurity.
Yes, we see a new trend that companies cannot anymore hire high professionals in cybersecurity area. The complexity of the technologies, the complexity of threat model aspects require combination between own employees and some specialized outsourcing companies. Otherwise, it can be always lack of expertise on the area of the customer side. Moreover, it's not only about cybersecurity skills. It's a general challenge for all of us who are big fans and who are business people for industrial revolution. I am a member of World Manufacturing Forum, and the title of this year report is a skill for manufacturing challenge. So it's a big gap between maturity of technologies and maturity of possible use cases and people who can implement and maintain and after in a productive mode. So it's a big challenge, it's a big problem. I don't think robots and cobots will substitute us in the nearest future to implement this complexity. So we have to think how to reduce the gap.
Okay, thank you so much. David and Philip, I'm going to ask you to wrap up this discussion on certainly cybersecurity, which we've discussed a lot, but also physical safety, which is the other important element of the work that is being done by the GMIS working group. Give us a few thoughts on what we should do next. What should the companies in the room think about when they go back to their businesses at the conclusion of this summit?
So I think, without over-promoting the research that has been done, I think pick up a copy of the report. It would be a very good starting point. There are some very interesting stories in there about where things have happened to date that we should be concerned about. There is also a list in the report that goes through all of the standards that we are aware of so far and all of the initiatives that we're aware of that have been undertaken, and that will probably give people the ability to then go and look in more detail at those. But I think the overall takeaway is probably to recognize that as industries, one of the overarching mantras, if I can put it that way, all of the occupational health and safety bodies around the world is that you are responsible for the risks that you create, and you're responsible for mitigating those risks. So it's not that you can look at this as being somebody else's issue, something that you can wait to try and address. If you are adopting these types of technologies, then you need to recognize that that you have an obligation to inform yourself, to make sure that your teams are informed about those risks. And I think there have been some very interesting incidents on the cybersecurity insurance side of things recently, where people have actually found out that they are not covered through insurance, and that has come as a huge surprise to them. And there are a number of quite interesting court cases on that are underway at the moment. So I think that's my closing point is that as businesses, you are responsible for the risks that you create, and therefore you need to take accountability for understanding those.
Thank you. David, concluding thought.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely agree about having a look at the report. I think at a very basic level, companies need more information. There are a few self-assessment tools that they can access, provided by different initiatives in different countries. I think companies should do at a very, very basic level a self-assessment of their cybersecurity risk situation. In terms of safety, if they are thinking already of introducing new technologies, something that we have been proposing is that we have talked about how standards are very slow, but there are examples of best practices out there, and companies can get together to develop guidelines that are more quickly produced than standards that could potentially represent a foundation or a baseline for a future standard development. So I think basically trying to work together to develop these guidelines, go and find self-assessment tools, information, that's as a basic, I think those are basic steps that could be taken.
Thank you very much. Always good to have a practical end, a functional end to all of our discussions. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panel, David Lale, Andrei Suvorov, Philip Rice, and Wang Shisong. Thank you so much. And I want to thank you for your attention. Just a note to say that we will resume tomorrow with a workshop at 9:30 a.m. on improving supply chains. That's in Hall D for those of you who are interested. For everyone at the summit, we will resume our plenary sessions all together in this hall at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.